standard set of gaming dice consists of 2 cubes, each with 6 flat, even sides, smooth edges, and 42 concave circles of equal size colored black to sharply contrast with the white surfaces around them. When rolled together, the dice offer 36 separate potential combinations for totals from 2 through 12. I found a single die abandoned in the hallway of the school where I currently work, and it pulled me back to memories of when I worked in a different school in a different state many years ago. That small white cube abandoned in the hall brought me back to a story of a young man we'll call Charles. He was a senior when I met him, having just taken over as his school's new head wrestling coach. It's understandably difficult for a high school senior to get a new coach in the final season of the sport, but Charles' former coach lost his job for good reasons, and he was relatively receptive of some new blood who could help him improve. Within the first 2 weeks of wrestling practice, well before the first competition of his senior year, Charles had demonstrated a fair work ethic and a great deal of athletic ability. His talent was raw but with a high ceiling. I wish this were the part of the story where I describe a montage of progress that culminated with an epic state finals match where the poor kid from a rural town nobody ever heard of had his hand raised in triumphant victory because he learned to believe in himself, or some other Disney-style story. I truly wish I could share that kind of cheesy, overtold tale with you now, but that's the story of some other kid and some other coach, and as I said, this is the story of Charles. Charles had 4 half-brothers sharing one mother who collected 5 child support checks per month, minus the number of fathers who happened to be locked up on any given month. One of his half-brothers was particularly repelled by the criminal and irresponsible life choices of his family. He turned to theater, sports, and scholastics as escape routes from his familial suffering. Charles, conversely, was drawn to the streets, consumed by the poverty he called home, and prone to embrace it rather than escape it. While his younger brother viewed school as opportunity, Charles mostly saw it as a compulsory part of life. He, like many young men, only gave the school system a chance because it offered him social interaction and an opportunity to play sports. While his little brother and teammates saw sports as an extracurricular, Charles saw class as ancillary to his enjoyment of athletics. Charles showed enough athletic promise to potentially reach the state tournament. With enough work, he could even be disciplined enough to compete at the college level. Charles became an ongoing series of what-ifs as I got to know him better. What if he had better coach in his first 3 years? What if he were born to a family with 2 caring and involved parents who encouraged him in the right direction? What if he were taught how to solve his problems without violence? What if his mother answered the phone when his teachers called? What if he wanted to do what it took to get into college? What if he had specific goals beyond high school? What if he made better choices? What if he could have seen the bigger picture? One afternoon during lunch, a pair of standard dice clattered over the dingy tile floor of the men's locker room in Charles' school. No cameras or adult supervision were available to prevent petty cash teenage gambling activities. No teachers, coaches, or half-brothers were there to talk any sense into Charles. So when he had to decide on participating or abstaining from the gambling, he participated. When he had to decide whether or not to bet money he didn't have, he chose to place the bet. When the dice landed unfavorably for Charles, and he couldn't pay the $3 wager he owed, the other boisterous teenager, equally ill-equipped to make wise choices, threatened Charles' life, right there in the locker room. It's easy for a young man raised by the streets with testosterone coursing through his body to feel as if he no longer has choices when his life is threatened. Charles knew only to strike first and neutralize the source of the threat before any harm came to him. Fight or flight. As the tension mounted, it became clear that the all-region wrestler's instincts compelled him to fight, while the all-American loudmouth's instincts urged him to run. So Charles chased the source of the threat out of the locker room, through the gym, down the hall, and into the busy cafeteria. His fleeing prey, in apparent desperation, thought he would be safe if he made it to a public location. That reasoning was only partially true due to the lack of decision-making skills at Charles' disposal. When he caught his target, Charles had another choice to make. In the presence of countless witnesses, including teachers and security guards, he could release the loudmouth and try to find $3. Or he could not. It was at that time that Charles effortlessly grounded the trembling teenager who moments ago had been threatening him. Charles immediately began staining the relatively clean November wax with the blood of his gambling opponent's face. The sound of both bodies falling to the floor clapped through the entire cafeteria like a pallet of cinder blocks falling all at once from a snapped line. A hectic crowd thickened around Charles and his victim, as teenagers often do, and the young man's strength was enough to shove one security guard back into the wild crowd with one arm. That was enough to dissuade the second guard from making an effort to pull the enraged 195-pound brute from his concussed and bleeding victim. There was only one person in the cafeteria willing to attempt to restrain him. The new head wrestling coach made his way through the crowd and pulled Charles from the humiliated collection of bruises, blood, and tears. Security footage later revealed that 47 seconds elapsed from the time the teenagers hit the floor to when I pulled Charles' thrashing body off and away from the scene. His victim looked as if he had sustained 10 minutes of battery. As I pulled Charles from the cafeteria, I also was pulling him from the high school for the final time. Predictably, this was not his first fracture of school rules, nor failure to manage his searing anger. He knew, I knew, and the rest of the morbidly entertained audience of his savagery knew this was not the kind of fight from which you returned physically or mentally, and he would be leaving the campus with steel bracelets today. I pulled Charles outside while the security guards dealt with crowd control. Just moments removed from the screams, cheers, cell phone pictures, and artificial lights of the cafeteria, Charles began descending from his peak of rage. His adrenaline slowly relented. Anger cooled to fear. Fear yielded to regret, and regret gave way to deep sorrow as Charles quickly stopped pulling away from me and instead turned into me, for a moment looking as if I would be his next target. I braced myself for a much better fight than his last opponent offered until his swollen hands, stained with someone else's blood, gripped the shoulders of my dress shirt, and his face sobbed against my chest. Charles never wrestled a single match for me that season. He never returned to the practice room, and it wasn't until the following year, after receiving his GED through an alternative education program, that he was allowed to visit the gym to watch his half-brother compete. His life did not end that day, but many potential paths were blocked off the moment he lost control. The one thing most educators and parents want for their students is options. There's no one path through which all young lives should be forcefully funneled. On the contrary, the more choices that life has, the more organically its roots can grow. Unfortunately, so many of the influences that lead to how developing minds will make those decisions are beyond their control. Anytime you have a chance to positively impact a young person, especially your own children, you may be compensating, even if in some small way, for any number of ways the deck may be stacked against him or her. While every one of us must ultimately be held accountable for our own choices, the cruel reality remains that the home in which we're raised, the values and parenting skills of those who raise us, the genetics we inherit, and so many other intangible factors do not arrive at the sweat of our brow or the result of our choices, but are rather determined with a roll of the dice.